Hey everyone, Dr. Liebreich here with your week 6 video, and this week we will be covering chapters 10 and 11. Oops, wrong thing. Consumer culture and the social self, and then ideology, intersectionality, and the beauty industry. I'm going to do a little housekeeping, lecture, exit pass, and reminders. Hopefully we'll get through this pretty short. All right. So as far as housekeeping, start preparing for your final exam. The study guide will go up shortly, probably after I finish this video and upload it. That's not until week 8, or I guess right after week 8 during finals week. But I just want to make sure everyone stays on track and is prepared and all that good stuff. It'll be the same setup as before. You'll get your study guide with all the vocab and everything from the textbook. You are responsible for material from the chapters we've read. There'll also be a little bit of review from the first half of the semester. And then, of course, anything from lecture and PowerPoints is also fair game. It'll again be multiple choice, true, false, maybe some matching, maybe some short responses, but there will not be an essay component. As always, if you have any questions regarding the logistics of the exam or really anything else, feel free to reach out. We can talk via email, or we can also do a virtual meeting on Zoom. I think that is it as far as the final exam. I don't have the day and time off the top of my head, but if you log into your Elmhurst student account, you should be able to see all that information. And I believe it's also on the syllabus. But again, if you have any questions about anything like that, feel free to reach out to me. All right. But without further ado, let's dig into new content, starting with chapter 10, Consumer Culture and the Social Self. So this chapter is rooted in quite a bit of sort of classical sociological theory. And so you'll see Mead, Goffman, a bunch of sociological theorists sort of front and center in this chapter. One of the things I want to talk about is the distinction between how people in the field of psychology understand the social self compared to sociologists, because both fields are social sciences, and in a lot of ways, they're closely related. Oftentimes, folks will get the two fields confused. So, in sociology, we are also interested in studying individuals sometimes, like folks in psychology are. However, we're more interested in how the social self interacts with other members of society. How do we as an individual fit into the broader culture and society, all that stuff? And so you'll see, even in this chapter where we're honing in on theories related to the social self, and individuals, we're thinking about what all that means for society. And so for thinking about the self, it's our understanding of how we think and feel we are as individuals distinct from others based off of societal influences. Symbolic interactionism comes up again. You should remember this from our classic sociological founding fathers stuff at the beginning of the semester. Certainly, many of you did a good job of incorporating this classic theory into your breaking a norm paper, which I appreciated. But in terms of consumer culture and the social self and implying symbolic interactionism, we're thinking about the social world and how it's created through everyday relationships and interactions. We construct meanings and we construct how we understand ourselves, our identities, through interactions with other people in our social world. Now, if you're thinking about some of those overarching themes that your textbook authors introduce at the beginning of the textbook and then weave in throughout, you might think about symbolic interactionism in terms of micro versus macro, and how this is really a micro understanding of the social world because we're thinking small scale. How do we as individuals interact with other people in our social world on a daily basis? We are the looking glass self. This is our sense of self, and the idea that our sense of self is always relational. So it develops through imagining how others perceive and evaluate us. Here, it's important to note that it's not necessarily about how other people actually see us, but rather it's more about how we think other people see us and how that then influences how we interact in our social world and with other people in our society and in our world. We have the I and the me. The I is the impulsive part of itself, wants likes and wants. The me is a socialized self developed through socialization, which again, you should recall from earlier chapters. And so, of course, sociologists are particularly interested in the me or the socialized self. However, we also have to acknowledge that the I exists, and some of the things that we do on a regular basis are rooted in our impulses and our impulsive part of ourself. Identity refers to a sociological concept that is sort of the different aspects of ourself. Our identities relate to social structures and other roles. So you might recall when I did the lecture on my master's thesis, where I talked about college students at party schools and risky behavior. I argued by the focus group data I collected that one of the ways in which some college students in that party school environment are able to help develop their sense of identity in terms of gender is by getting into these physical altercations with another college student. And so we can think about what identity means and how identity is developed through our social interactions with other people and what that means for our identity and our sense of self. Now, as far as thinking about what identity means in relationship to social structures, we can start to think about intersectionality, which is sort of a sneak preview for chapter 11. But we should be thinking about sort of these big identity categories that we value within our society, like race and class and gender, and how those identity categories are sort of projected onto us based off of social constructs. And then they influence heavily how we're able to operate within social structures in our society. And so we can think about what does it mean to navigate a social institution such as higher education as a white woman like me, or as a Black man like my BFF, my work BFF at my previous institution. We would talk a lot about this and how our identities sort of influence how other people in higher education understand us and perceive us. And then that in turn influences how we do our job. And that can be true of pretty much any social institution we have. Stigma is a deeply devaluing attribute, a spoiled identity, viewed as both different and undesirable. I think that's a pretty lay concept. And then finally, I want to talk about total institutions and Goffman's work. Now, we've talked a lot about social institutions so far this semester, but a total institution is a social institution that I guess you could say is heavy handed and how it influences our everyday lives. And so, if all social institutions influence our lives in some capacity, thinking about higher education again, Elmhurst and being a student or working at the school, it influences what time you have classes. Like you can't take classes at midnight, right? And then that in turn influences when you're able to work a job, when you're able to participate in your family life and take care of your parents or your children or hanging out with your friends. If you live in the dorms, being a student is going to influence when you eat, where you eat, what kind of food you have access to. And so it's a social institution that influences your life. It is an example of a total institution, which I'll talk about in a minute, but higher education will continue to influence your life even once you graduate and you're no longer a student. So it may not have that total institution effect on you anymore, but the degree you acquire and the job prospects that are available to you once you graduate, that's all based off of what your major is, where you went to college, if you graduated, all those things. So even after higher education may not have quite as much of a hold on your day-to-day social world, it's still going to continue influencing how you operate within the social world. And so in that sense, it's a social institution. Now, a total institution, this is where people are cut off from the rest of society for a prolonged period, and their entire social world essentially is wrapped up in this one social institution. And so, again, in higher education, I argue this can be an example of a total institution if you're living on campus, you're living in the dorms, and every single aspect of your life is influenced by the college you're at, living on campus. You're sort of cut off from other parts of society, so you're not living with your family or a significant other, things like that. Some other examples of total institutions include prisons, psychiatric wards. Some students have argued in papers that the military is an example of a total institution. And so, sort of the classic example that Goffman used when he was writing his book on total institutions, he wrote about psychiatric wards. All right. Just as a reminder, there are additional vocabulary terms, theories, and methodologies in Chapter 10 and all of the chapters that I don't cover in lecture or PowerPoint. So make sure you're keeping up with the textbook and all of your readings so that you're prepared for the final exam. All right, Chapter 11, Ideology, Intersectionality, and the Beauty Industry. So we'll start off talking about body work. This is work done by the self and or hired workers to manipulate and manage the body to conform to cultural norms. We can also think about the role of ideology and intersectionality. So, on that note, how does ideology influence beauty standards in the United States? Well, we tend to think about beauty standards with regard to women and femininity. And so in the United States, there's this expectation that women, people who are feminine, are supposed to be thin, young, white. They're supposed to wear a lot of makeup. A lot of this is tied to consumer culture and capitalism as well. We can also think about the role of media, in particular social media, TV shows, and movies, and how young white women make up a fairly small portion of the United States, and yet they're really front and center on TV shows, movies, and even if we think about influencers on social media, right? And so if we think about intersectionality and we think about age, social class, race, and all these other identity categories, we can start to say, well, hey, maybe our beauty standards should be more diverse because the mainstream notions of what beauty should look like in the United States is so narrow, and it doesn't necessarily truly encapsulate everyone within our society. Intersectionality, again, this should be reviewed, but it's when multiple aspects of identity and social location, multiple systems of inequality, if you will, intersect to shape social advantages and disadvantages. Now, when we talk about privilege and oppression and intersectionality, sometimes students, especially if you've never taken a class in sociology or a similar social science field, sometimes students who carry a lot of privilege can get a little defensive during class conversations on these topics. And so it's important to point out that privilege is something that just is, it exists, you're born with it. If you're born a man, you have gender privilege. If you're born white, you have race privilege. If you're born upper middle class, you're in the 1%, you have socioeconomic status privilege. And so we can start to think about, what does that mean in terms of our social location? What does that mean for society and social institutions? And how do we, as members of a society, operate on a daily basis in our everyday lives based off of these identity categories we have that either carry privilege or historically have been met with oppression? And so these are tools and ways of analyzing our social world and our lived experiences. And again, just thinking about how these things all relate to beauty standards, so race, class, and gender, it's really easy to do an intersectional analysis of the beauty industrial complex, the beauty industry. All right, I promised short and sweet. You got short and sweet. Here's the link for your exit pass. Don't forget to do that. As a reminder, discussion board 4 is due, your individual post is due Friday at 11:59 p.m. And then you need to respond to at least one classmate by Sunday at 11:59 p.m. Try not to wait to the last minute to do your individual posts, so there's not this scramble on Saturday and Sunday for everyone to sort of respond to their classmates. Your final exam study guide will be available momentarily, so download that from Blackboard. Make sure you have access to it early so that if you have questions as you're filling everything out, you can reach out to me well before you need to take the exam. But other than that, have a nice week, and I look forward to hearing from folks virtually soon. All right, bye everyone.